Okay, so in a study that really should come as a surprise to nobody, there was a study done by, I don't think the group is actually, oh yes, it's a study that's in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that examined police body camera footage of 557 routine car stops involving black drivers. And what is the conclusion? That when police officers start off with a command, instead of telling the person who was stopped, oh, I don't know, um, maybe pleasantries like, how are you, hi, how are you doing? Did you know that you were speeding or whatever? But if they were to just give a command like, keep your hands on the wheel or turn the car off, things escalated because the police officer is already in a combative mode. They're already assuming that things are going to escalate. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So this should come as a surprise to absolutely nobody. And what else shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody is that this study initially wanted to look at escalations among white drivers and police officers, but they couldn't find enough. So again, this should come as a surprise to absolutely nobody. At least anybody who's willing to accept that this stuff happens. Obviously, those who have their head in the sand and don't want to admit that the way police interact with people might have something to do with stuff. Now, this study didn't conclude racism, but considering that this isn't really happening to white drivers, kind of implies that. I mean, it's entirely possible that the cop is like, that this particular cop happens to be like that with everybody, that they're combative with everybody regardless of race. So that's always a possibility. But it does kind of look bad for the cops are racist thing. Does not help that cause at all. But anyway, let's get into the article. So, 81 of those stops ultimately involved searches, handcuffs, or arrest. That kind of outcome was less likely when a police officer's first words provided a reason for the stop. Which I don't see why there are police officers who have to be told that you should first tell the person in a traffic stop why they're being stopped. Did you know that your tail light was out? Did you know that that you were speeding? We actually had this happen to us years ago. We were just coming out of our house, and we have a police officer who just so happens to live in the neighborhood. At least he did at the time. And it just so happened he saw us leave and started tailing us. And of course, we were like, why is the cop following us? We pulled over, and at the stop sign at the first intersection, and he said, oh, did you know you left your garage door open? And we did indeed know that. I mean, we did that on purpose because we weren't going to be gone that long. But just the fact that he nicely asked if we were aware that he was just being a good Samaritan, why is that hard? Why do you assume that people are going to jump at you? I mean, granted, there are traffic stops. Now, this was just routine traffic stops that they tested, not, oh, by the way, that car that you're following has a warrant for his arrest for, I don't know, a robbery. That wasn't a part of this study. Now, that I can understand people being combative because you already think that this is someone dangerous. So, still maybe not the best tack, but understandable. These are just routine traffic stops, for speeding or a busted taillight, which unfortunately police officers will use as an excuse to pull over black motorists. That is true. I will not deny that that would solve all problems, but this shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone that the reason a lot of these stops ended up in escalation is because the police officers started being in a heightened state of combativeness. And if they were just chill and treat the person behind the wheel not as a potential enemy, but as someone who, just broke the law for whatever reason, people speed. Sometimes it could be their odometer is broken, their speedometer is broken, or they might be, concentrating on something else and didn't realize that they were speeding. Or I know when I was learning to drive, you get so used to the feel of a certain speed that suddenly you have to slow down and it feels like you're crawling. So you don't necessarily realize that you're speeding because you're going what you think is the speed limit. And if you're not looking at the speedometer, yeah, or you're late for something. There's all sorts of reasons why people speed. Granted, there's also the I need to get to a certain place by yesterday, and there's actually no reason behind it. I just want to get to my destination as fast as possible. Those things happen too, but there's a reason for it, and it's not necessarily because someone is dangerous, or at least that's not the intent. So, yeah, this doesn't come as a surprise at all. So it says here the first 45 words, which is less than 30 seconds on average, spoken by a law enforcement officer during a car stop to a black driver can be quite telling about how the stop will end. So this was said by Eugenia Rowe, a researcher at Virginia Tech. Amid the recent high-profile killings of Tyre Nichols and other black motorists after traffic stops, the findings offer a grim sketch of how police stops can escalate and how black men recognize the warning signs. Rowe and her colleagues focused on black drivers because this group is stopped by the police at higher rates and are more likely to be handcuffed, searched, and arrested than any other racial group. The car stop is by far the most common way people come into contact with the police, said Jennifer Aberhart, a social psychologist at Stanford University. With the spread of body-worn cameras, we now have access to how these interactions unfold in real time. All of the stops in the study occurred in a racially diverse, medium-sized U.S. city over the course of 1 month. The researchers won't identify the city for privacy reasons. The vast majority of the stops that we're looking at are stops for routine traffic violations, like I said, not for other things that are more serious. The scientists controlled for factors such as the officer's gender and race, as well as the neighborhood crime rate. About 200 officers were involved in these stops. It's not really a function of a few officers driving this pattern, said Rowe. The words or actions of the person behind the wheel of the car didn't seem to contribute to escalation. The drivers are just answering the officer's questions and explaining what's going on, says Eberhard. They're cooperative. And that's generally what we've seen for body cam footage that gets released to the public. That, yeah, there's some black men who run away, but considering what they deal with when they do what they're supposed to be doing, listening to the police and still ending up getting killed, you can understand why some men want to take their chance at just trying to run away. So, to understand how black men perceive the initial language used by police officers during a car stop, the researchers asked 188 black men to listen to recordings of the opening moments of car stops. It turns out, perhaps not surprisingly, those black men were highly attuned to the implications of a police officer starting an interaction with a command. When officers began with orders without reasons, black male participants predicted that the stop would escalate in over 84% of those cases. And even though none of the stops in the study involved the use of force, black men were worried about the possibility of force 80% of the time when they heard a recording of a law enforcement officer issuing a command without offering a reason. In this country, we know much more about fearing black people than the fears of black people, says Eberhard. Many black people fear the police even in routine car stops. That fear is a fear that could be stoked or set at ease with the first words that an officer speaks. Which sounds reasonable. I mean, that should be the standard for anyone. Like I said, if you approach someone in a combative manner, of course they're going to respond in kind and be combative because they're fearing for what's going to happen next. I mean, you're already a man who's legally able to fire a gun is approaching you and barking commands and treating you like you're less than, like you're not a human being. Of course you're going to get scared and also possibly get defensive, because who wouldn't? Anyway, Eberhard notes that millions of people know about the killing of George Floyd in May of 2020 after police officers pulled him from his car, but far fewer people know what happened in the first moments when he was approached by an officer. We analyzed the first 27 seconds of Floyd's encounter with police on that day, and we found that Floyd apologizes to the officer who stands outside his car window. Floyd requests the reason for the stop. He pleads, he explains, he follows orders, he expresses fear, she says. Yet every response to Floyd is an order. So, again, not surprising whatsoever. But at least in Floyd's case, the officers got what was coming to them. From the very beginning, police officers issued commands without giving Floyd an explanation, the same linguistic signature associated with escalation in this study. Tracy Mears, a Yale law professor and a founding director of the Justice Collaboratory at Yale Law School, reviewed the study and says she found it gratifying to see this kind of social dynamic measured with such precision. It's hard to deny then, she said, noting that some communities are rethinking whether they want armed law enforcement to be involved in traffic violations. There are stark racial differences in who is stopped and who's not, says Mears, who points out that in the 1-month period covered by the study, the city's police officers did 588 stops of black drivers and only 262 stops of white drivers. And no, it's not because white drivers are more law-abiding. Anyone who thinks that is not living in reality. Over 15% of black drivers experience an escalated outcome such as a search, handcuffing, or arrest, while less than 1% of white drivers experience one of those outcomes. They're not drawing any conclusions from that, But these are things we should just be paying attention to, says Mears. It strains credulity that there are that many more traffic violations. Because of course there isn't. People will do stupid things in traffic. They'll run red lights. Whether it's because they just didn't see them or because they thought that, oh, nobody's around, I can run the red light, right? Run the stop sign, whatever it is, or I'm in a hurry, so I need to speed, or whatever the traffic violation is. Everybody does it because everyone is human. To say that black people do it more than white people is just beyond ridiculous. So Rowe says in planning this study, they had initially set out to look at patterns related to traffic stops escalations for white drivers too, but realized that it happened so infrequently for white drivers that there just weren't sufficient numbers to even include them in the analysis, which I had already mentioned. And that says a lot for the way police officers probably generally treat white people. Now, it could also be that maybe white people are less sensitive to, being barked at. I guess that's possible, but I can't imagine anyone would want to be barked at, even by a police officer, just because they happen to be police officers. So I'm thinking, even though they didn't conclude racism, I'm going there. I am totally going there because I just don't see how it could be another reason. I mean, I guess it could be, but it's just, with these numbers, it's kind of hard to just wave it off as just something certain cops do. It really is. And they even mention it in the study that this shows that this isn't just, a few bad cops, that this is more widespread. So they're basically, even though they didn't want to draw the conclusion for whatever reason, they were kind of implying they knew that it was racism. That racism was the reason for it. Now, it would be interesting to see this study of other minority groups, other minority groups that aren't necessarily historically thought of as having problems at traffic stops. I don't know if they looked at different Asians, because even though people talk about Asians, they're not a monolith. Asians there's many countries in Asia, so it would be nice to see, but maybe it could be the same thing as for white people, that there isn't a statistically significant amount of data, or to do this with Hispanics or natives or Pacific Islanders. Well, that works with Asians, so never mind that last one. But for natives, which there aren't that many natives, but still, it's just, it would be nice to get more than just, how blacks are affected over whites. It would be nice to see the breakdown of traffic stops for other groups. But these are the two big ones, definitely. So yeah, this study really doesn't tell us anything that we really didn't know. I mean, granted, you probably would think that more officers would be pleasant in their first interaction, because how do you know from afar before you peek in? You don't necessarily know the race of the person you're pulling over. So, yeah. But anyway, that is that study, and I just thought it was interesting in that they also had that second tier of how black men saw a tape of a traffic stop, how they said that it would go. So that part I found more interesting than the conclusion that treat people nice and there won't be an escalation, and that it's usually the cops that do the escalation. Well, we pretty much knew that. The only people who didn't know that are those who, when they saw what happened to George Floyd or Tyree Nichols, took the police officer's side and twisted themselves into knots to prove that the police officers were not the bad guys. So, but yeah, most people would probably read the study and be like, yeah, this doesn't tell me anything new. Hopefully, for those people who do treat it like, oh, you should always listen to the police officers and they would never steer you wrong, blah, 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 that they'll see this study and they'll be like, oh, maybe the police aren't infallible. So hopefully this study will benefit those who refuse to accept otherwise, that there is a problem and that it's not the problem of the person who got pulled over, but it's the interaction. It's the police officer who started things off on the wrong foot by treating them like they're enemies, like they're going to like a self-fulfilling prophecy that if they don't do this, then they're just going to get the jump on. Whereas they basically end up getting what they thought they were going to get because of the way they treated the motorists to begin with. So, I think I've just beat this dead horse to death. So I will see you guys in the next video.